As I said, happy Valentine's Day. I know that this image is not from the time we're talking about, it's from the 20th century. But did you know that before the sentimental cards and the flowers that we exchange today, they presented their loved ones with something called love ribbons? I'm going to talk about that a little bit tonight. So this image I like because she's really cool and spunky, like a lot of the people I'm going to be telling you about tonight. Also, she's wearing a ribbon. Also, it is Votes for Women. So I think that's all pretty great. So I'm here tonight to talk about the romances of Phillips Manor Hall. So it's not surprising, as the place held so much romance for me growing up. I grew up basically down the street from here in Hastings-on-Hudson. But it was a surprise to me when I first learned about it as an adult. Researching my book, The Women of the House, I had a great ride through the environs of that earlier era, the colorful, exciting, and sometimes pungent experiences of that era. So it's something of a secret history because there are so few primary sources, but evidence does exist, especially the house in Yonkers, which spoke to me and practically begged, "You must tell my story." So I did. So it's look at both the nitty-gritty of trade and politics, and also the requirements of a proper tea setting. The public and the private, the important and the trivial, coexisted as surely for people of influence back in the day as they do today for the boardroom and Botox at the same time. So I'm going to focus mainly on the women of Phillips Manor Hall, because that's what interests me, but also share a picture of their menfolk and what their love lives might have been like. So forgive me when I tell you that I see the ladies in these relationships as stronger than the men. They were. They came from hardy Dutch stock, and the fortune that the first generation made descended to all the others. And in colonial society, money made strength. So the men were cool, no doubt, a trader, a politician, a military guy, even an expert rose gardener. But you will see that in each liaison, the women were cooler. Some of the men in the story are Frederick Phillips I, Frederick Phillips II, Frederick Phillips III. Let's call them Freddie I, Freddie II, and Freddie III. Their wives might have had better pet names for them, you know, Shugum, Sweetheart, Pumpkin, we don't know, but the historical record doesn't tell us that. So Freddie will have to suffice for them all. So what about the first romance here? Margaret Hardenbrook and Frederick Phillips I, Freddie I. One thing you need to know as we begin, Margaret was extraordinary. She came to New Amsterdam in 1659 at the age of 22. The first street map of Manhattan was commissioned by the Dutch West India Company the year after she first stepped off the boat. So we know what her world looked like in some detail. All 15 streets, dwellings, warehouses, even sloops anchored in the harbor. By the way, what we don't see here is the seals that supposedly sunned themselves on the rocks just off the tip of the battery. True story. So we can see where she and Freddie raised their children on Stone Street. It was the very first street to receive a paving of cobblestones, the most elegant thoroughfare directly opposite imposing Fort Amsterdam. An accurate picture of Margaret would have to render not only her business transactions, but also equally pressing concerns, such as the quality of her child bed linen. That was the set of ritual sheets and clothing that held vital sway for Dutch bred women. You can see here a typical interior from the time with a mom and her newborn twins and the women who attended her. This could have been Margaret and her babies. This is a casse, a standing cupboard that any of these women would have had at home. Margaret's would have resembled this one, painted with fruits, symbols of fertility, and legs like cannonballs. A casse stored linens, including the all-important handkerchiefs that were then known as nose cloths, made sense, and plenty of the utility fabric called diaper. That was used not only for babies, but essential in that time to clean up messes before paper towels. The streets of Manhattan were thronged with business-savvy she merchants, including midwives and merchants and proprietors of seafood shops like this one. So Margaret coexisted with other hardworking women, but her exploits were perhaps the most astonishing. She merchant was a term women in commerce used to describe themselves. The golden age of the Netherlands was especially golden for women in business. Their business acumen was actually legendary, as was their tendency to lift up their skirts and moon someone they found annoying. Yes, that is true. Here is a somewhat sanitized rendering of New Amsterdam colonists strolling along a canal called the Herengracht. Margaret's signature on a notarized acknowledgement of a debt from January 9th, 1664. This print shows two colonists engaged in the trade of goods that include furs and tobacco. It's the most accurate picture we have of what Frederick and Margaret might have looked like. Margaret's ships included small vessels called flute ships. These are seemingly bulging with merchandise. This is the tiny harbor they would have set out from and sailed into. Phillips Manor Hall has given us also a very nice likeness of her engaging in her business, beaver hat set squarely on her head. So this is important to remember in terms of her marriage to Freddie. She was anything but the submissive, cowed helpmeet that gets conjured up when we think about women back in that era. Perhaps they were primarily business colleagues. That's okay. However, they did have 4 children together, so that suggests they did share a marital bed. Margaret had already been married once to a trader with a small fleet of ships. She expanded her fleet when she became a widow and inherited his property. She called the first one she built on her own the Margaret. Did I mention she had confidence? Then she remarried Frederick Phillipson, who was also a lot older than Margaret. He was 36 years old. Freddie one was a carpenter, but had a side gig trading tobacco. In both marriages, she retained control of her property. So was she mainly a meal ticket for this hungry bounder? There must have been an element of calculation on both sides, as he could use her wealth and status to further his increasingly ambitious goals. But perhaps her shrewd nature let her fall in love with what might be. A spouse could do a lot to shape her mate's potential, then as now. So now the couple expanded their fleet to 24 vessels. It was an extremely lucrative shipping concern that brought furs to Amsterdam and household goods back to eager customers. I like this Dutch painting because it shows the landscape where the linens Margaret obtained would have originated. You can actually see the fabric laid out to dry under the sun. When England made New Netherland, New York in 1664, the rules changed. Margaret was not legally supposed to trade under her own name. What do you think happened? She traded under her own name. Shipping manifests show the scope of the Phillipses' commercial enterprise, but they also suggest the stuff of their daily concerns. When Margaret transported iron hatchets, stockings, goose quills, these were also products that served an integral role in her own household. Another ship carried women and girls' bodices, different kinds of linen, buttons, knives, ivory combs, pins, hooks and eyes, men's stockings, pewter toys for children, frying pans, lace, tobacco pipes, a parcel of small looking glasses. And what about their ships going to Holland? Well, one carried, I'm not going to tell you the thousands of numbers, but one carried beaver pelts, bear, buck, cowhides, foxes, timber minks, cats, otters, and musquashes, that's muskrats. So the merchandise was anything but abstract to Margaret, who literally had her hands on all the products she brought to market. It would be hard to overstate the importance, though, of what was termed good merchantable beaver. Um, People needed, craved, and depended upon beaver to make hats. The fur's unique interlocking hairs made beaver hats not only beautifully glossy, but waterproof. And this was so important in a day before widespread use of umbrellas. This is an early proposal for New Amsterdam's coat of arms. It shows the values. And from a little later, a trapper showing off a pelt. You can see and touch a similar pelt today in Phillips Manor Hall, just downstairs. By the way, the use of arsenic poisoned and killed so many people that were involved in processing the beaver pelts for felt. Processing beaver felt with chemicals is what made the Mad Hatter mad. All that fur had other uses, of course. Over time, fashions changed and there weren't so many beavers left to bring to market. Still, some of the critters still reside in Westchester. My brother gave me this beaver chewed stick. So you can go up to T-Town and you will still see the measures they've had to take to keep them from devouring the trees there. Frederick and Margaret shared a house, the house that came to be known as Phillips Manor Hall. Though probably in that era, it was referred to more often as Margaret's Joint or Margaret's Jam, in Dutch, of course. In 1670, the couple bought 300 acres of prime Westchester land, thick with forests of virgin timber and interspersed with fields the Lenape had cleared for farming. The purchase included a sawmill standing astride the Nepperhan River, which emptied into the Hudson. By the shore, a midden of discarded oyster shells was a chalky reminder of native feasts there. There were no roads, only narrow trails leading through the forest, no European neighbors, so you can imagine the quiet. In 1682, the flute ship, the Margaret, sailed from Amsterdam carrying building materials, 60,000 bricks, hand tools and saws, as well as 4 millstones. Access to the Hudson in downtown Yonkers is almost completely gone. But if you go a little further north to Untermyer, you can imagine yourself into the view they would have had back then. That original house may not look fancy to contemporary eyes. Its exterior walls were locally dug rubble stone. Its interior would have been coated with whitewash, not paint. It had just one room stacked on top of another, but it was a veritable castle in its time. So the stone house in Yonkers doubled as a secure warehouse for goods they shipped between Manhattan and Albany. And the Hudson served as really the superhighway of the time, of the Hudson Valley. Margaret installed a ponderous door on iron hinges, carved of ebony and commissioned from Africa by the she merchant herself. The house was most likely built by both enslaved and paid laborers. Archaeological evidence suggests that the recipe for the mortar used to assemble the green tile floor in the basement included lime from burned seashells, a formulation that originated in Africa. There was a brick fireplace with a tongue of flagstone that extended into the room and provided a generous space for preparing meals. Something odd struck me about Margaret's fireplace when I first saw it. Dutch burghers usually employed tile work in pure white or sober biblical allegories in safe shades of blue. The Phillips hearth, on the other hand, was framed by tiles in a stylish minor key tint called manganese that resembled more or less the magenta blue brown of a fading bruise. The theme reflected some craftsmen's cracked vision of what they called the Wilden of the New World. Artists and writers without firsthand knowledge of lands abroad still portrayed the scenery of America as crowded with cyclops and unicorns and other beasts. The Phillipses knew better. They dealt directly with the local Indians. One exchange provided the land's native proprietors with blankets, kettles, shirts, stockings, guns, gunpowder, hatchets, hoes, earthen jugs, iron pots, rum, beer, tobacco, and 130 fathoms of white wampum. That's a lot of wampum. Phillips Manor Hall stores the secrets of its past in its essential structure, in its floorboards and its windows, its mantelpieces and its moldings. In some ways, the house resembled its creator, Margaret. It was crude, vital, improvisational, strong, and built to last. You can still walk the floors of old-growth yellow pine, something I really like doing. They finally assembled a 57,000-acre estate that comprised most of today's Westchester County. It would be called the Manor of Phillipsburg. So Margaret was not all sweetness and light. She trafficked in slaves. When I learned this, I felt disappointed in her. But we must remember that she was a product of her time. As far as my research has gone, there were not a lot of abolitionists in early New York. So please correct me if you know different. Since the 16th century, the slave trade had become well established, and it would be only natural for a major trader like Margaret to take part. But what was she like as a person? And what about her marriage to Freddie? There was a journal kept by a missionary named Jasper Dankerts that profiles Margaret in lavish detail. This lithograph comes from that journal and shows the west side of Manhattan along the Hudson. It was a familiar sight when Margaret traveled south from Yonkers to New York. So Dankert's portrait of the she merchant is not so nice. Margaret was shrewd, parsimonious, miserly. So those were the typical assessments of her as she supervised the Charles, her merchant ship, and its cargo. At the same time, she was supervising her 12-year-old daughter, who she brought along with her on this 6-week transatlantic ride. Most pertinent here, it seems Margaret was having a tryst with a passenger. Much to Dankert's horror, Margaret's right-hand man aboard the Charles was an intense, impulsive Dutchman, identified only as Jan. They shared an open, secret liaison. According to Dankert's journal, the captain of the ship was very assiduous or officious to please, especially Margaret and her man. Margaret's other man, Frederick, had stayed behind for this trip, as he often did. We hear about Jan in other records as well. At the age of 37 and at the top of her game as a trader, in 1675, Margaret seemed to be experiencing some friction in her marriage. Transcripts from a courthouse in Albany, where she and Frederick had taken a house, show that Margaret had declined to accompany her husband on a trip to New York, as he wished. Frederick took himself over to the local Dutch Reformed Church to plead for intercession from the ministers there. He asked if they might come to his house to persuade his wife, if possible with kind words, to reconcile with him. As the men of the cloth entered her household, these were Margaret's first words: "You have the devil in you." Jan Gerritsen, the Phillipses' servant, burst into the room in an angry and excited mood, uttering bitter words, and cursed the ministers. Frederick lost it. He took Gerritsen by the arm and thrust him through the inner door. So Jan describes the she merchant as, in some way, his soulmate. When the ministers returned the next day, Jan was still in the house. He asserted that Margaret, quote, clung to him, Jan Gerritsen, as her God and savior. Perhaps she did cling to him emotionally, and in a marriage that was increasingly about business, not love. Perhaps she even clung to him physically. The servant lived intimately with the couple, sleeping under their roof. It would seem pretty easy for an independent woman like Margaret to stray, especially if her husband spent a lot of time not there and there was a willing man on the premises. So 4 years after the Albany incident on this ship, Jan made comments about Margaret. At one point, awaiting Margaret at the start of the voyage, he had this to say: "If this wind blows over our heads, I will write her a letter which will make her ears tingle." He seemed well conversant with the idea of Margaret being a tingle. Her marriage to Frederick continued, however, until she died in 1691 at the age of 54. Oddly, there is no record of her death. No will, no nothing. It's as if she simply vanished. Maybe she got pushed overboard, who knows? On to the next romance. The year after Margaret died, Frederick remarried. He was in his 60s by then, and Catherine Van Cortlandt was in her 40s. So all know Van Cortlandt Manor, those Van Cortlandts. Catherine grew up in Manhattan on Stone Street, just down the block from Margaret and Freddie's house. Catherine was already an heiress. Now she moved into the house on the Nepperhan. Despite the heat provided by their hearth, the occupants were out in the woods, all by themselves, with no neighbors, no tavern, no church. They would surely need to stay warm. How did they manage that? They wore plenty of furs. This is an etching made in 1643 by artist Wenceslas Haller, titled Winter. So Haller gave us an incredibly textured understanding of just how important fur was to fashion back then. If you want to go down a fashion rabbit hole, Wenceslas Haller's your guy. The subject is wearing an accessory known as a sun-expelling mask, a hot, high-fashion item for protection against the elements. Some versions included a silver mouthpiece to hold it in position with two silk strings dangling silver beads that the wearer gripped in either corner of her mouth. So Catherine was a pious church-going woman, quite different than a she merchant. It seems Freddie might have been worn out from his first marriage and needed a change. A later watercolor shows the Phillipsburg Upper Mills on the Potomac River as the property would have looked in Catherine's day. Catherine was busy. She supervised the building of Sleepy Hollow Church, completed in 1697, which has endured for over 300 years in Tarrytown, New York. Catherine maintained her pious demeanor even as her husband descended into illicit trade with the pirates of Madagascar. He was punished for that transgression and basically bounced from the merchant trade. A letter from Freddie in this period to his Madagascar slave suppliers says, "It is by Negroes that I find my chiefest profit. All other trade I look upon as by and by." We can see Catherine at the top of the list of the first parishioners the year the church opened. No sign of Freddie, though. Right. When Freddie died, Catherine had him buried in the Phillips vault in the church that she had built. So here is a romantic sidebar, the first of three I'll give you tonight. We don't know a whole lot about Philip Phillips, the firstborn son of Margaret and Freddie. Aside from the fact that Philip assisted in his parents' business as a budding merchant and ship captain, they bought an estate on Barbados for him in 1674 called Spring Head. The Phillipses used Barbados for a couple of reasons. First, the family sold necessities to the people there, like beef and barrels and casks of rum. They brought back sugar. Sugar has become an absolute necessity in the colonies, partly because tea drinking had become so fashionable. It was packaged in cones like the one you see here. On Barbados, Philip married somebody named Maria Sparks. So let it be known that they did not participate in the horrific slave-driven sugar economy there. A map from the time places Spring Head in one of the island's least fertile areas. So they didn't grow sugarcane there, nor did they own the people who produced the sugar. The enslaved people who worked the boiling houses customarily lost fingers or hands to grinding mills. The average life expectancy there was 17 years. So Philip and Maria both died young in 1699. Philip in September and Maria in October. Barbados records list the cause of death as belly ache, aka dysentery. Not a happy death. Freddie freaked out, believing that the tropical climate had killed his eldest and favorite son. He sold Springhead and spirited Philip and Maria's baby, Freddie II, back to New York. So Freddie II's grandpa died 3 years later. In his will, Freddie I specified that Catherine should be charged with raising the young orphan. Ever diligent, Catherine spirited the child off to England for 9 years while Freddie studied and got a law degree. I wanted to see what Springhead looked like. Sorry, this is a bad image. So I Googled it. Here was what I found. So you can see it's a luxury property. In any case, the estate remains probably haunted by the ghosts of Philip and Maria. Now we get to an interesting romance, Freddie II and Joanna. By the time he returned from England in 1716, Freddie was steeped in all things British. His inheritance from his father made the young man one of the richest people in New York. He wound up a successful politician and a gentleman rather than a merchant. He served as an alderman, a justice of the peace, a surveyor, and he founded New York's first public library. Then he became a court justice for the colony when he was 33, and he did that for the rest of his life. So Joanna Brockholst married Freddie II as a 19-year-old ingenue in the 1720s. Even at middle age, Joanna remained fashionable. This shows her in a shawl-like fichu, it was called, studded with a fat satin bow, her hair covered by a simple white frill of a cap. So this was undoubtedly day wear. So Phillips Manor Hall became a site for political and social gatherings, and she became the consummate political wife. The couple doubled the area of the house seamlessly. So to your left, you can see the part that they added, and you cannot even see the distinction between the old and the new. They did it so well. They added a parlor with a fireplace in the English mode with a smaller and Wilden-free hearth. They enlarged the manor hall's windows. They remodeled the fireplace with the head of Diana, goddess of the hunt, glamorous in a wash of seafoam tinted paint. They installed a new staircase with a railing of polished mahogany imported from Jamaica. Ultimately, they switched the main entrance to the now more fashionable Albany Post Road. Now, how did these two meet? We actually know quite a bit about how people went about romancing each other in the 1700s. New York offered opportunities for assignations. We have a map from the time drawn by one Mrs. Bucknard. It's the first known map of Manhattan rendered by a woman. It detailed the popular haunts that mattered to citizens such as herself or Joanna. It shows evidence of having been folded. I'm not sure if you can see that here. I've always thought of it as a pocket guide for an out-of-town visitor, a friend of hers coming to the city. On it, she marks the pleasure gardens where guests could dance, dine, stroll. They might ooh and ah over fireworks displays. The only formulas developed at that time were yellow and orange, but they surely would have found them awesome anyway. On either side of Bowery Lane, she rendered the symmetrical pools that were famous as sites of pastoral idols. They were called Buttermilk Pond and Sweet Milk Pond. So there were all-day turtle feasts at houses along the East River. One Reverend Andrew Burnaby described these flirtation marathons where, quote, 30 or 40 gentlemen and ladies meet to dine together, drink tea in the afternoon, fish and amuse themselves until evening, and then return home in Italian carriages, a gentleman and a lady in each carriage. So what do you think went on in those private carriage rides? There was also something called the Kissing Bridge. There, the same vicar noted slyly, quote, "It was part of the etiquette to salute the lady who has put herself under your protection." I wonder what kind of salute that was. Mrs. Buckner drew her map in 1735. In 1741, the pleasant world of pleasure garden strollers was rocked by a 1741 uprising in New York City. Mass executions followed, with 21 men and women hung, 13 burned at the stake, and 72 expelled from the colony altogether. The rebels included not only Black people, but Irish folks. One of the so-called conspirators, the first to die, was Cuffy. He was a slave on the Phillipsburg Manor plantation. These events set the whole New York area on edge, but did not prevent those who lived in the lap of luxury from enjoying every minute of that luxury. Joanna and Freddie, too, now retreated up to the safety of Phillips Manor Hall more often. They finished the expansion off with a whole new Georgian wing, which you can see here. So let's return with them to the safer aspects of the time of the wonderful world inhabited by the Phillips family. I think we need to ask ourselves, how did a person dress for date night in the mid-1700s? We actually know something about that. I was astonished during my research about the luxury these people enjoyed, the fresh fish and wild strawberries, the rum punch they relished, the sumptuousness of their satin petticoats. This painting depicts a woman pretty happy over a love letter. At the same time, a randy, gamey quality counterbalanced that luxury. People reveled in delicious feasts and elegant table linens, yet detested soap and water. Women cosseted themselves in extravagant, one-of-a-kind gowns commissioned from famous European designers, yet they wore no underdrawers. It just wasn't done. Perhaps that explains Dutch women's mooning as a result, as an insult of choice. It was just convenient. The historian Mimi Hellman tells us that courtship was conceived then not so much as a pursuit of overt sexual expression, but rather an exchange in which individuals sought to engage and delight each other with an artfully conducted repertoire of pleasing poses, gestures, expressions, and conversation. Kisses were stolen in just the same way back then. Many women adopted le sac, the French gown that had pleats beginning at the nape of the neck and flowing down the back. They wore gloves in pastel shades, perfuming the satin or kid with a scent of hyacinth or musk. So this was olfactory sexiness. Men were just as vain as women, of course. A typical New York stud wore breeches that were glove tight. According to one colonial raconteur, a gentleman ordering from his tailor said, "If I can get into them, I won't pay for them." He also wore a corset, yellow kid gloves, silk pumps, and carried a chicken skin fan. One fashion curator explains that the breeches in the 18th century were short and stopped below the knee, so it was desirable to have a nice S-curve to the calves. If you lacked that natural S-curve, naturally you could wear a padded version, as he is. So, aristocrats loved their wigs, but you knew that. Here is a portrait of Joanna and Freddie II's son, Philip, in 1750. We can't see his calves, but pretty sure they're padded, or maybe he had naturally shapely legs. We don't know. The macaroni got his name from the rising excitement at the time around a new treat, Italian pasta. He sported tight waistcoats, heeled shoes, rouged lips and cheeks, lace cascading from his collar and sleeves with bejeweled fingers and manicured nails. Of course, men did not always dress up. At home, a gentleman would wear a flowing open robe called a banyan. Fake beauty spots were all the rage. No posh party would be complete at the Manor Hall or anyplace else without the appearance of patches, temporary beauty marks that were affixed with gum to the faces of men and women alike. They might be tiny hearts or crescent moons cut in black silk. Men and women carried patch boxes made of tortoise or china or brass or silver, ever ready to repair or replace a silk beauty mark as needed. Fragonard, the painter, captured the erotic spirit of the time in his famous 1767 painting, The Swing. Feast your eyes on this charming tableau. As the nice young lady swings with a pert twinkle in her eye, she goes up in the air just far enough so that a nice young gentleman might have a glimpse under what English poet Robert Herrick termed the tempestuous petticoat. Some things don't change much. Here is Catherine Deneuve at her wedding some years later, and the photographer has taken the place of that young gentleman in the Fragonard painting. There was no doubt some swinging at a typical St. Valentine's Day party at the Manor Hall when Joanna's daughters, Mary, Margaret, and Susanna, and their brothers Philip and Freddie too, were teenagers. By then, coming up to the manor would have been sort of like making the trek out to East Hampton from here with a horse and buggy rather than a jitney, but a lot bumpier. This was the era of the love ribbons I mentioned at the beginning. They made popular gifts for Valentine's Day. They adorned dresses, chemises, jackets, and hair of women and men both. When Freddie too died of tuberculosis in 1751, he was interred in the family vault at the church Catherine built. You can go there to pay homage. But you might choose instead to visit the grave of Washington Irving, another rabbit hole. Irving was one of the major hotties of the 1800s, somewhat akin to Mick Jagger in the 1960s. So Joanna died from a fall from her carriage in 1765. Freddie III was the eldest of Freddie II and Joanna's 5 children. He was 31 when he married Elizabeth Rutgers in 1756. She was 24 and he was 36. Big age difference, as always. Elizabeth had been raised in New York, the daughter of an important naval officer. This was her second marriage, the first to a landed mogul with a huge estate on Manhattan's East River. She brought his fortune with her when she wed. She bore 11 children, 9 of whom survived to adulthood. Lots of kids, too. There seemed to be plenty of time to burnish this pleasure palace. One visitor called the Manor Hall, quote, the hospitable center of all that was best in the provinces. People arrived by sloop for parties there and took sleigh rides on the rock-hard ice of the Hudson. Freddie III was apparently quite the guy, if you like, a rich man who didn't like to get his hands dirty, aside from puttering in his terraced rose borders. John Jay described him as, quote, a well-tempered, amiable man with a penchant for gardening, planting, etc., and employed much time and money that way. Freddie #3 was a great catch in some ways, and others not so much. He was, after all, a Phillips, giving him a fortune and great reputation. He trained with the Westchester Militia, and he gained the rank of colonel, a moniker he bragged on throughout his life. But he never served any time in active duty. He might not have been able to. Accounts tell us he traveled alone in his horse and chair because his girth kept him from squeezing into a standard carriage with his wife. Elizabeth and Freddie III commissioned a new fancy papier-mâché ceiling for the southeast parlor. You can still see it downstairs. It showcased wreaths and flowers, themes of music and the hunt, satyrs, and a pelican that was an ancient symbol of Christ. Freddie sold the upper mills, finding their management tedious. Instead, he focused on completing the Episcopal Church adjacent to the Manor Hall, St. John's. He did attend every meeting of the New York Assembly. He introduced an urgent bill to, quote, prevent the killing and destroying of partridges and quails on the manor of Phillipsburg. Very important. Parties continued at the Manor Hall. Fashions grew even more extreme, courtesy of Marie Antoinette. the day's foremost fashion icon. Those who followed the French example like to wear something called panniers, which you can see here. A double metal frame extended her skirts by as much as a yard on either side. A woman, it is said that the doorways of the time were widened to accommodate panniers, including at the Manor Hall. A marvelous painter named Louise Elizabeth Vigée Lebrun captured that period, including this one of Marie Antoinette and her progeny. We even have Lebrun's self-portrait, another amazing woman, another worthy rabbit hole. Second sidebar, Susanna and Beverly. Joanna and Freddie's second daughter, Susanna, married well to military star and Virginia native Beverly Robinson. The couple built a house on the upper reaches of Philip's land. Beverly, no doubt, looked better in real life. Mary and George, George and Mary. Was this the most famous love story that never happened? A book came out a few years back about the love-crossed pair. It was what I would describe as a work of faction. History, novel, some of both. So let's suspend our disbelief and go with what we know. We have a portrait of Mary from when she was just out of her teens. You can see her self-satisfaction, her spunk, underneath that dainty mob cap and with a delicate embroidered rose at her bosom, a black velvet ribbon encircling her throat. So Mary liked this image so well, she rendered a copy of it herself in her own hand. Her brother Freddie III's sumptuous Philip's Manor Hall was a place where Mary came of age. She was born in 1730. Already in her mid-20s, fast approaching spinsterhood, Mary could also escape the countryside and go south to New York City if she wanted, to stay with Susanna and Beverly at their house on, of course, Stone Street. They all lived on Stone Street. For a young lady like Mary in 1750s New York, as the revolution gradually approached, a fitted uniform jacket with epaulets and a saber was a potent aphrodisiac. During the French and Indian War, it seemed that a major purpose of the war was to serve up waltz partners to the debutantes of New York. When George met Mary in 1756, he was 24 and in the middle of an arduous 500-mile horseback expedition. He was already a war hero. He led his troops in July 1755 at the Battle of Monongahela. The earliest depiction of George gives a pretty good idea what the man who wooed Mary might have looked like. He stopped off in Manhattan at Susanna's Stone Street townhouse because Beverly had been a schoolmate in Virginia and Mary happened to be visiting there at the time. Perhaps George wasn't Mary's first choice for a beau. It would have been hard for her not to notice the pitted skin of his face, a relic of the trip he made to Barbados in 1751 and the smallpox he contracted there. And his demeanor then and always was stiff and awkward, not much of an invitation to lovemaking. Mary had no lack of admirers. She was the it girl of her day. A comic effort by a fellow soldier satirized the so-called company of one Captain Polly Phillips with the quote, killed, wounded, deserted, and discharged during the campaign of 1756, satirically listing fully 39 officers who had a hankering for Mary, Polly being a conventional nickname for Mary at that time. General Webb, he noted, was, quote, wounded, but 'tis hoped may serve. Captain McAdam was desperate. Captain Delancey, not accepted, et cetera, et cetera. Mary's fans were legion. It seemed that one Captain Roger Morris had suffered more than any other man at the hands of Captain Polly. Morris, the spoof continued, had been, quote, shot through the heart. Morris was the son of an English architect, and he had held an officer's commission. He had also served with Washington at Monongahela. Another account from the time tells us a bit more about George and Mary and Roger. An officer named Joseph Chew goaded the rising star Virginian about his competition in a letter that has survived all this time. He said, I often had the pleasure of breakfasting with the charming Polly. Roger Morris was there, don't be startled, but not always. You know him, he is a ladies' man, always something to say. The town, he continued, talked of it as a sure and settled affair, but he said, I can't say I think so, and that I much doubt it. A bit tortured syntax, perhaps, and it might have tortured Washington. Chew promised to, quote, set out tomorrow for New York, where I will not be wanting to let Miss Polly know the sincere regard a friend of mine has for her. And also, I am sure if she had my eyes to see through, she would prefer him to all others. Suffice it to say, Roger became Captain Polly's squeeze. So was her reason for marrying Roger in part because he was more familiar, coming from a more British background than Washington, the Virginian? Was he more vulnerable, perhaps a bit easier to manipulate by a strong heiress who preferred a helpmate to a head of household? So Roger, this helpful portrait from the time shows him in full dress uniform, all moist eyes, claribow mouth, ever so slightly receding chin. Mary's wedding to Roger in the southeast parlor at Phillips Manor Hall was the sensation of the 1758 social season. We have no record of Washington attending the nuptials. Freddie III gave away the bride. It said his attire included, quote, the gold chain and jeweled badge of the ancestral office of the keeper of the deer forests of Bohemia, an artifact that could have been found in a Cracker Jack box for all its authenticity. At the end of the wedding, an odd event transpired. The feast was cut short by the appearance of a mysterious Indian, one who must have come a long distance, as the Lenape had long since been driven off the Philipsburg land. So he stood wrapped in a scarlet blanket at the threshold of the banquet room. He uttered just one sentence. Your possessions shall pass from you when the eagle shall despoil the lion of his mane. So that would in fact happen, but not for a few years. After the wedding, the two built themselves a white confection of a mansion in northern Manhattan to rival her childhood home. When Mary and Roger built their house, they were on top of the world, pretty much literally. Mary still alternated between her city digs on Stone Street and summers at the Manor Hall, where her childhood home had been snugged down at the base of the Nipperhands Cascading Falls, its property sloping gradually down to the river. At the Morris Mansion, they had a bird's eye view all around. Here's what it looked like then. You could see 360 degrees in all directions. Today, like this, things do change. Then came the war. I don't have to tell you that history, I don't think. Not when the romance is so much more interesting. Mary and Roger purchased a home on Stone Street. Frederick III and Elizabeth maintained an abode nearby, as did Susanna and Beverly. Despite the coming revolution, a woman like Mary would have enjoyed the opulence and peace of the 1760s. Women now wore something called a polonaise, a new style French import that poofed up the gown in the back with ribbons, like a balloon shade. It made for a jutting bosom, corset shrunk midriff, and bulging buttocks. Women now adopted white powdered wigs. Some enjoyed so much leisure, they spent a full day preparing for social events, for the coming social events of the evening, and a gentleman might be allowed into the dressing room for hours of chat, while a hairdresser worked his magic on what was called the head. Was Mary the typical socialite of the time? She might have been a wee bit busier. If you ever built a house or added on to a house or just feathered your nest with somebody, you know it can bring you closer together or it can drive you to divorce. We can imagine that this is what happened with Mary and Roger. Some details remain from the original structure of the Morris house. The floorboards are virgin oak, a staircase with a turned mahogany rail. You can see preserved an old hand-hewn beam. They covered the whole house with white pigment, which was just then coming into vogue. It had a portico and Tuscan columns in the front with a grand front entryway, and they added faux finishes, including coins of wood that simulated stone. You can still see them today. So it beamed out style, sophistication, and wealth. It took over 3 years to complete, busy, 19 rooms, 7 bed chambers, a newfangled octagonal drawing room, which was unheard of at the time, and equally interesting, the basement kitchen with its elevated old windows. What did it cost? £3,500, a small fortune. If you visit, make sure you walk a few blocks to see a mammoth English elm, the only tree that remains from when the house was first built. Make sure you touch its crusty, wise old bark and feel the pounding of its historic heart. So their sense of peace was not to last as the revolution erupted. 6 days after the British routed the Patriots from Manhattan, New York went up in flames. A giant conflagration consumed the city. Mary had already fled from the couple's Stone Street house up to the Morris house on the hill and on to the Manor Hall. So an authentic portrayal of an heiress in 1776 would have to showcase simultaneously her preoccupation with luxury as well as the devastation she would have witnessed. We know that these flames were visible from Phyllis Manor Hall, as they were when the trade towers went up in smoke on 9/11. New York City was not very romantic after the fire, unless you find the idea of millionaires pitching a tent out of cast-off ship sails over burnt-out chimneys and ruined brick walls romantic. In the 1760s, the popularity of Boston artist John Singleton Copley exploded, his fame launched by the display of one of his efforts, A Mischievous Boy and His Pet Squirrel, in 1765, Rabbit Hole Alert, or perhaps Squirrel Hole. Mary did not appear so mischievous in her 1771 portrait, which she and Roger like to refer to as Copley's performance. She was a matron by then of 41 with 4 kids. She wore this ultra chic white satin adorned with a trendy Turkish-style belt, and you can see the melancholy yearning in her eyes. By the time of the New York fire, Roger was gone. Just after the war started, he took himself to England on a mail packet, rejoining his siblings there, and also reuniting with his eldest daughter, Nancy, who was then 15 and at a finishing school in London. He said that if he stuck around, the Sons of Liberty might torch the family's property because of his presence there. So good going, Roger. Mary sent her remaining 3 children off to safety at school or upstate with Susanna. Roger wouldn't return until the close of the war, leaving her on her own. He wrote her some emotional letters. Here's one. Would to God we were together once more. You cannot conceive, my dear Mrs. Morris, how much I think of you. Your repeated marks of tender love and esteem so daily occur in my mind that I am totally unhinged. Only imagine that I, who you very well know, never thought myself so happy anywhere as under my own roof, have now no home and am a wanderer from day to day, and were it not that I am thoroughly convinced that no misconduct of mine has brought me to this disagreeable, unhappy, and for the present unavoidable situation, I should be most wretched indeed. In actuality, at this time, Roger had taken comfortable chambers in London. He spent his time playing social calls there and to friends' fine country estates. He took the waters at Harrogate Resort. He accompanied a friend on a pleasure excursion to Germany. And he also kept a stern eye on his maturing daughter, Nancy, his, quote, already too womanish daughter. Freddie III, in the meantime, found himself carted off to prison in Connecticut by the Patriots. Fortunately for him, he was able to make special requests to dutiful Elizabeth. He wrote in one letter, quote, a few good lemons would be very acceptable to be brought to him by Diamond, his enslaved manservant. Only the best for Freddie 3. When Mary fled Mount Morris, something odd happened. George moved into her house. It was the perfect site from which to wage a military campaign. At today's Morris Jumel mansion, his war room has been restored, and you can see it there, complete with era-appropriate wallpaper and the original vermilion moldings. Okay, final sidebar. We know of 2 married enslaved people who lived at the Roger Morris home during Washington's tenure there in the fall of 1776. Hannah and Isaac Till had been rented to the father of our country as cooks. They would have known intimately the open hearth I showed you under the lavish mansion. No further records exist of their relationship. So when Hannah and Isaac prepared his meals, Washington, now a 44-year-old general, would stride behind the octagonal drawing room at the Morris estate to survey the scene. He was known to crack Brazil nuts between his jaws. The habit cost him all his teeth by the time he was president, necessitating dentures made from carved wood, cow's teeth, elephant ivory, even hippo tusk. He was driven by pain into the jaws of laudanum. What would Mary have thought of her erstwhile lover roaming the Mount Morris grounds? We don't know. What we do know is that it must have been rough in Yonkers at the end. The mercenary Hessians who worked for the British had made themselves at home on the Phillipsburg estate, plundering vegetables from the fields and beef cattle. The menace in the tone of one officer about the local women is clear. Quote, "They have small and pretty feet, good hands and arms, a very white skin, and a healthy color in their faces," which requires no further embellishment. They also have exceedingly white teeth, pretty lips, and sparkling, laughing eyes. He could have been writing about pretty Polly. Much later, long after the revolution, after the new government banished Mary and the rest of the family as traitors, long after they reestablished themselves in England, long after the manor of Phillipsburg was divvied up and the manor hall went from rooming house to city hall, Yonkers buried the Neperhan River underground. The mill ponds had been making citizens sick for years. So they paved paradise and put up a parking lot, literally. Finally, fairly recently, people fond of history and the environment daylighted the river. So it rushes again past the manor hall. It's not exactly the same, of course. The Neperhan had been rerouted to a more convenient path. You can no longer shoot the rapids from on high. Still, though, history has been resuscitated. Let's take one final look at the grand old manor hall. Here is the thing about history. You can try to bury it, like the Neperhan, but it continues to percolate underground, waiting for us to discover it afresh. It's kind of like romance in that way. Margaret and Susanna, Maria and Joanna, Elizabeth and Hannah and Mary, even uptight Catherine. Their husbands, all those Freddies and the others, surely found these fierce, savvy, fabulous women exceptional. They were lucky enough to win them over on Valentine's Day and every day. They thank you for remembering them and their romances, the romances of Phillips Manor Hall. Thank you. Can I take questions?
Yeah, I think we can do some questions. We probably have some questions in the chat here. So let me just see what we've got online. If we have anybody. No, not anybody online yet. Do we have anybody in the house? Yes, I'm going to bring the microphone over so the folks online can hear us.
I was just wondering if Margaret had any, if she ran any enslaved ships.
Yeah, there is a famous example She and Frederick the First, they brought over on, I believe, the Charles early on the first enslaved people for Phillipsburg Manor. Okay, they brought them over. A lot of them died on the way, but some were remained. I think it's 8 people, and they marched them across the land to Phillipsburg, and they enslaved them at that time. So yes, she did. That wasn't her primary line of work, but she did engage in that as well.
Okay, anybody else have any questions? Yeah.
Thanks for the revolting picture of George Washington's teeth. My understanding was that at least a couple of the teeth were purchased from his enslaved people. Is that your recollection as well?
Yes, I've heard that as well. Ultimately, I believe that all he had in his mouth was one real tooth, one of his original teeth, and so they had to build these dentures around them. But yeah, I have heard that.
Okay, anybody else have any questions? Yeah, Deb.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the book, The Women of the House. You referenced today about the Lenape that appeared at the wedding. Do you have a source for that? I'm just really curious because I'm a docent at the Old Dutch Church in Sleepy Hollow, and I have told that story, but I wasn't quite sure if it was a legend, a part of the Phillips family legends, because there's so many legends, as we know, in Sleepy Hollow. But yeah, if you could talk about that.
I believe that it is a legend, but as with many legends, it probably has some basis in truth. I mean, at that time, there were not very many Native Americans in the area anymore, but they still had a symbolic importance for the people who lived here. So I think that was a way of talking about that relationship. And also, I believe that when that legend originated, it said more about the coming revolution than anything else, when the Phillipses would be toppled and it would become American rather than British. That's my understanding.
All right, we have a question online from Tom, who says, I'm wondering why there was such a gap between when the British took over New Amsterdam and when the Dutch were allowed to conduct their own financial affairs. That might be in reference to women.
I'm sorry, I don't understand. Can you repeat?
So it sounds like he's asking why it took, so we talk about Margaret being a businesswoman into the 1770s.
Right.
Or sorry, the 1670s. So he's wondering why there's a gap between why the Dutch
after the British
to
why after the British changed the rules for women. Why? Well, there was a very strong Dutch tradition, and so sometimes those things don't change overnight. And as a matter of fact, something interesting is what I've heard said. It's no accident that in New York State, Seneca Falls, you've heard of that, and women's rights, that all took place in New York State for a reason. It's because of the inheritance of these strong Dutch women.
I think also, Tom, I'm just going to chime in. This is Sarah from Phillips Manor Hall. I think part of it also is in Dutch tradition, there's a very strong tradition of both prenuptial agreements and wills that distribute property equally among children regardless of their gender. And I think that is a tradition that is not prevented by British rule. It's still allowed within British rule, although it's just not as common. And I think that's part of the reason why, like with the Phillipses, you get to the third generation in the 1750s, and Fred II is apportioning his lands equal. Like Fred III obviously gets Phillips Manor, but then the upper patent, the Highland patent, gets distributed equally between the remaining children, regardless of their gender. So.
Right, and that was a huge thing, that women would have money to use as they saw fit. So even though the British did clamp down on laws pertaining to women in business and said that a woman, as I said, I think, could not practice her business under her own name, people still did it. It was kind of like in the breach. They did that because they had the money to.
Any other questions?
So I don't know if your research included this, but you say in your book right at the beginning, and you mentioned tonight that Margaret, the she merchant, that part of yes, she was extraordinary, but part of it was that women having that kind of a role was really accepted in Holland. So was Holland or the Netherlands, whatever it was called then, culturally alone in this phenomenon, or was
Yes.
this accepted in
No,
other places in Europe?
no, Holland was totally alone. The Netherlands were totally alone. In Holland, girls were taught math. They were taught to write. They went to school along with their brothers, and this made a huge difference. So women were their skills were cultivated at an early age. For some reason, and gosh, I wish I could tell you why. In the Netherlands, that was something that was encouraged, and it was well known also. And so you just did not have, as you did in other countries, like the people that came over from the Puritans, as an example. And women they did not have that kind of a strong role there. And it was a cultural thing that existed at this time, very definitely.
Some of it is related to the Dutch Reformed Church. The Protestant Reformation, the Netherlands were part of the Spanish Empire and were Catholic. And part of the Reformation with the Dutch Reformed Church was, people needed to be educated in order to be able to read the Bible. And the Dutch just decided that women also needed to be able to read the Bible. And they had public education through the church, which was uncommon compared to a lot of other countries. So I think that played a really big role too.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah.
Sorry,
I didn't know that.
I have to give my 2 cents too. Any other questions? I don't know if we got any online. No, nobody else online. Anybody else in person? David, one more question.
Thank you so much for coming. What are you working on now?
Thanks for asking. So one thing I do now, and I've done for the last 10 years, is work as an arborist, a professional arborist. And that's taken a lot of my time. And I've done a lot of writing about trees, and now I'm working on a book about the history of the American forest, focusing on women's participation in that, which is also kind of a secret history, largely unknown. So that's a lot of fun.
Okay, last call. Any more questions? No? Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Jean.
Thanks, everybody.